The Silence of the Lambs wasn't just a chilling psychological thriller, it was a battle between art and chaos. Beneath the polished, Oscar-winning surface, the set was a pressure cooker, dangerous improvisations, FBI involvement, casting changes, and an actor who blurred the line between man and monster. What audiences saw was a masterpiece of precision. What happened behind the camera was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying. Today, we're diving into 20 weird facts about The Silence of the Lambs that most fans don't know. From Hopkins scaring Jodie Foster without warning, to props pulled straight from real murder files, to a secret detail almost no one notices. Stay until the end. You'll never watch this movie the same way again. Now, let's begin. Fact 1. Hopkins's first scene terrified everyone. Anthony Hopkins didn't just play Hannibal Lecter, he exploded onto the set like a predator set free. His very first scene with Jodie Foster was filmed with no rehearsal. On purpose. Director Jonathan Demme wanted raw fear. Hopkins stood perfectly still, never blinking, his cold eyes locked on Foster. She later admitted she was genuinely trembling, not as Clarice, but as herself. Then came the moment that made history. Hopkins suddenly added the slurping hiss after describing his meal of fava beans and Chianti. It wasn't in the script. The crew froze, unsure if they should laugh or cry. That creepy sound became the film's most chilling line. Here's the twist. Hopkins created that hiss because he once knew a teacher who made a similar sound while mocking students. He recycled that memory and turned it into movie legend. Foster was so shaken that she avoided casual chats with Hopkins off-camera, not out of disrespect, but pure survival instinct. Fact 2. Foster refused rehearsals with Hopkins. Jodie Foster wasn't just nervous, she was strategic. After that first take, she realized Hopkins's presence was overwhelming. Too much familiarity, she thought, would drain the tension between Clarice and Lecter. So she made a rule. No rehearsals, no small talk, no comfort zone. When the cameras rolled, the energy was electric because it was real. Foster later admitted she was genuinely scared of Hopkins the entire shoot. That distance turned into powerful on-screen chemistry, even though, in reality, it wasn't chemistry, it was fear. And here's something most fans don't know. Hopkins and Foster didn't have a proper conversation until after the film wrapped. At the cast party, Hopkins finally approached her casually. Foster said it felt like meeting him for the first time. That means every ounce of tension we see between them on screen came from real distance, not acting tricks. Fact 3. The FBI helped write the script. This wasn't just Hollywood fantasy, it was backed by real law enforcement. Screenwriter Ted Talley and director Jonathan Demme wanted accuracy, so they worked directly with the FBI. Foster was given rare access to Quantico, where she shadowed trainees, sat in on classes, and even watched real psychological profiling sessions. But here's the hidden layer. The FBI saw the film as a recruitment tool. They hoped Clarice Starling's smart, tough character would inspire women to apply. And it worked. Applications reportedly spiked after the movie's release. The cooperation went deeper than people realize. The FBI actually reviewed parts of the script to make sure the agents weren't shown as careless or incompetent. It wasn't just research, it was also PR, with Hollywood acting as the Bureau's megaphone. Fact 4. Lecter's cell broke the rules. Lecter's glass prison cell is one of the most iconic sets in movie history, but in real life, no high-security inmate would ever be kept behind glass. Demme and his production team rejected bars because they wanted audiences to see every twitch of Hopkins's face. The glass made Lecter look like a specimen on display, less like a prisoner, more like something otherworldly. The white walls and eerie reflections turned the cell into something closer to a science exhibit than a jail. An extra touch? The crew used special lighting to make Hopkins's reflection sometimes appear faintly behind Foster during conversations. It gave the illusion that Lecter was inside her space, even though he was locked away. That subtle trick made audiences lean in without realizing why it felt so unsettling. Fact 5. The moths were real. The death's head moth wasn't a fake studio prop. It was alive. The production team worked with an insect wrangler who imported real tobacco hornworm moths, but the famous skull pattern on their backs? That's fake. It was painted on with safe, tiny decals. Handling them wasn't easy. To keep them still during filming, the moths were chilled in refrigerators, then slowly woken up under warm lights so they could move on cue. Crew members even used little brushes to guide them. Here's an odd detail. U.S. Customs nearly delayed filming because the moths had to be shipped overseas, and permits for live insects were tricky. If the shipment hadn't cleared, Demi planned to switch to mechanical moths. Thankfully, the real ones arrived, giving the film one of its creepiest, most symbolic details: transformation, fragility, and obsession, captured in a flutter of wings. Fact 6. Gene Hackman almost directed and starred. The Silence of the Lambs could have been a totally different movie. At first, Orion Pictures secured the rights with Gene Hackman set to direct and star. Hackman was fresh off his Oscar win for Mississippi Burning and saw it as his next big step. But when he read the full script, Hackman changed his mind. He felt it was too dark, too violent, and could hurt his reputation. He walked away, and the whole project nearly collapsed. That decision opened the door for Jonathan Demme, a director known mostly for quirky comedies. At the time, people doubted him, but Demme's fresh vision, mixing horror with quiet intimacy, turned out to be a genius move. Here's the kicker. Hackman later admitted he was glad he dropped it, because Demme made a film he probably never could have. What looked like failure was actually fate reshaping movie history. Fact 7. Buffalo Bill was based on real killers. Buffalo Bill wasn't pure fiction. He was stitched together from real-life nightmares. Thomas Harris, who wrote the novel, studied killers like Ed Gein, who skinned corpses; Ted Bundy, who lured women by pretending to be injured; Gary Heidnik, who kept women locked in his basement. Bill's obsession with transformation, wanting to make a woman suit from skin, came from Gein. His manipulative tricks echoed Bundy. Even his odd tenderness for his dog, Precious, was pulled from true crime cases. The scary part? Every detail was carefully chosen to feel possible, not just shocking. Harris and the filmmakers wanted audiences to walk out thinking, someone like Buffalo Bill could exist right now? That's why Bill is so unsettling. He's not just a villain. He's a mirror of real horrors stitched together. Fact 8. Ted Levine struggled with Buffalo Bill. Ted Levine gave one of the most disturbing performances in movie history, but it nearly wrecked his career. Levine feared he would forever be seen as a monster. The role demanded he go to dark places, dancing in the mirror, tucking his body, and speaking in that eerie, broken voice. After the movie came out, casting directors avoided him. For months, Levine couldn't find work. People confused him with the role, thinking he was creepy in real life. In truth, Levine was soft-spoken and thoughtful. Here's something fans may not know. Levine worked with Demme to add small, quiet details to Bill, like the way he handled Precious with care, or how his voice cracked when he said, "It puts the lotion on its skin." Those moments made Bill more human and therefore more disturbing. It wasn't just shock value. It was acting that left scars on Levine himself. Fact 9. Lecter's creepiest line was improvised. "You know what you look like to me, with your good bag and your cheap shoes?" That famous insult wasn't delivered as written. Hopkins added his own timing, his own venom, stretching the words just enough to unsettle Foster. The unpredictability was the key. Foster later said she never knew exactly how Hopkins would speak, and her nervous reactions were real. That's why the scene feels like a real psychological attack, not just acting. Here's the fun part. Hopkins said he built Lecter's rhythm like a piece of music. He compared it to playing the piano, pausing, striking, holding silence at just the right beat. That's why even a simple insult feels like it could cut through steel. Fact 10. The Goodbye Horses dance almost didn't happen. Buffalo Bill's haunting dance to cue Lazarus's Goodbye Horses is one of the film's most unforgettable moments. But it wasn't in the script. Ted Levine suggested it himself, arguing that the audience needed to see Bill's fantasy, not just hear about it. At first, producers hated it. They thought it was too weird and would kill the movie's pacing, but Demme fought for it, saying it was crucial for showing Bill's obsession with transformation. Levine choreographed the whole performance, blending vulnerability and menace. Fact 11. The crew was unnerved by Hopkins' stillness. Anthony Hopkins didn't rely on shouting or wild movements. His weapon was silence and stillness. On set, he would stand completely motionless between takes, staring at cast and crew with unblinking eyes. Some crew members admitted they avoided looking at him directly because it felt like Lecter was studying them. Hopkins even trained himself to blink less, which gave his stare a reptile-like intensity. Jonathan Demme later said Hopkins could dominate a room without raising his voice or moving an inch. And here's a creepy detail. Hopkins sometimes practiced moving silently around the set so people wouldn't notice him until he was right there. That sense of quiet control seeped into his performance, making Lecter scarier than any jump scare ever could. Fact 12. The film was shot out of sequence on purpose. Most movies are shot out of order, but Demme did it for a special reason. He scheduled the most intense Lecter-Starling scenes first, before Foster and Hopkins got comfortable with each other. That way, their early encounters carried genuine tension. For Foster, it meant diving headfirst into terrifying scenes before she fully understood Clarice's journey. By the time they shot calmer moments later, she already felt emotionally drained, exactly like her character. Here's the trick. Demme used the shooting schedule as a psychological tool. Foster once admitted she felt like she was unraveling in reverse, which is why Clarice looked so worn out by the end. The order wasn't just convenience, it was part of the storytelling. Fact 13. Scott Glenn was haunted by FBI training. Scott Glenn, who played Agent Jack Crawford, wasn't spared from the darkness. As research, the FBI gave him access to real training materials. Among them was a horrifying recording of serial killer Lawrence Bittaker torturing a victim. Glenn said it haunted him for years. He went into the project against the death penalty, but after hearing that tape, his views changed. It wasn't just research, it was trauma. The scary thing? Glenn later said he wished he never heard it. Even decades after the movie, he admitted those sounds stayed with him. His calm, authoritative performance carried real-world scars most viewers would never suspect. Fact 14. The butterfly poster hides a secret. The film's poster is legendary. Jodie Foster's face with a death's head moth covering her mouth. But here's the hidden detail. The skull on the moth's back isn't just a pattern. It comes from a famous 1951 Salvador Dalí photo, where a skull is formed from nude human bodies. The design wasn't random. It symbolized the mix of beauty, death, and hidden darkness. Most viewers never noticed it, but for those who did, it made the image even more disturbing. And one more touch. The poster's colors, red, black, and white, were chosen to mimic warning signs in nature, like venomous animals. Even before audiences saw the movie, the marketing was already whispering, danger. Fact 15. Lecter's mask was designed to dehumanize. When Hannibal Lecter is strapped to a dolly wearing that muzzle-like mask, it's pure nightmare fuel. But that mask wasn't the first choice. At first, the team thought of a surgical mask or even a gag. Hopkins suggested something more primal, something that made him look like a predator. The final design, with its exposed teeth and cold straps, was partly inspired by a hockey mask but twisted to look less human. Here's the genius of it. The mask didn't just restrain him, it stripped away humanity. He wasn't dressed like a man being transported. He was dressed like a beast. Even the leather straps were made to look rough and animal-like. It's why that single image has lasted for decades. It turns a human face into a monster's snarl. Fact 16. The film faced LGBTQ+ backlash. When The Silence of the Lambs premiered, it wasn't celebrated by everyone. LGBTQ+ activists protested outside theaters, accusing the film of reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Buffalo Bill's obsession with transformation was seen by some as a negative portrayal of queerness. Jonathan Demme later admitted the backlash hurt him deeply. The script clearly says Bill is not transgender, but many audiences missed that line. The protests were real. During awards season, picketers stood outside holding signs like, "Stop demonizing us." The controversy stayed with Demme. As a response, he later directed Philadelphia, 1993, one of the first major Hollywood films to openly tackle AIDS and homophobia. It was his way of balancing the cultural impact of Lambs, not denial, but atonement through art. Fact 17. Lecter rarely blinks. Ever notice how Lecter's stare feels inescapable? That wasn't random. Hopkins studied reptiles and predators, noting how they barely blink when sizing up prey. Then he trained himself to blink as little as possible on camera. The effect was chilling. Lecter feels less like a man and more like an alien presence, always watching, never breaking eye contact. Viewers felt pinned to their seats, as if Hopkins could see through the screen. Hopkins later said, "It's a small trick, but it unnerves people more than any scream ever could. It's proof that sometimes the scariest thing an actor can do is nothing at all." Fact 18. The ending was filmed in secret. The iconic ending, Lecter on the phone saying, "I'm having an old friend for dinner," was handled like a top-secret mission. Demme feared leaks, so the script pages weren't given to most of the crew. Hopkins and Foster only saw them right before filming. Hopkins actually recorded several versions of the line, some playful, some cold, some almost joking. Demme chose the one that felt both elegant and terrifying. When audiences first heard it in theaters, the gasp was real. Even much of the cast didn't know how the film would end. That secrecy turned the final moment into one of the most unforgettable curtain drops in movie history. Fact 19. It won the Big Five Oscars. At the 1992 Academy Awards, The Silence of the Lambs made history. It swept the Big Five: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Only 2 other movies had ever done that. It Happened One Night, 1934, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. To this day, no film has repeated the feat since. What makes it even stranger? Lambs was a horror thriller released in February, far from awards season primetime. The win proved horror could be prestige cinema. Hollywood couldn't ignore the genre anymore. Fact 20. Lecter appears for less than 17 minutes. Here's the shocker. Hannibal Lecter, the most unforgettable villain in movie history, is only on screen for 16 minutes and 46 seconds. Demme and Hopkins agreed that overexposure would weaken the character. Lecter had to be like a storm: arrive, destroy, and vanish before you've caught your breath. That scarcity made him more powerful. Hopkins later said, "You don't need to be there the whole time. You need to haunt it." And that's exactly what Lecter does. He haunts every frame, even when he's not in it. Bonus fact: the real Silence of the Lambs. The title isn't just a creepy metaphor. It came from real interviews Thomas Harris had with FBI trainees. One young agent recalled growing up on a farm, hearing lambs scream during slaughter, and being haunted by the sound for life. Harris used that memory to shape Clarice's backstory. For Jodie Foster, this was the emotional core of the film. She said it was the hardest scene to shoot, not because of Lecter's taunts, but because she connected to Clarice's vulnerability. The silence of the lambs symbolized innocence lost, and the desperate need to save just one life to quiet the screams. The Silence of the Lambs wasn't just a thriller. It was a cultural earthquake. It forced Hollywood to take horror seriously, forced audiences to face real psychological terror, and pushed actors into the darkest corners of human behavior. Behind every frame was chaos, secrecy, and artistry colliding. More than 30 years later, the film still whispers to us, still stares at us from behind that glass. If you loved uncovering these hidden truths, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment on which fact shocked you the most. Because in the world of cinema secrets, one thing is certain: Hannibal Lecter is always watching.